Welcome, everyone, to this session on political polarisation from Policy Institute at King's College London and UK in a Changing Europe. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's. I'll be chairing this session, and I'll also slip in my own 5 minutes of thoughts at the beginning, which I'll tell you about in a second. To look at the questions and thoughts on this, we have a truly expert panel. First of all, we have Maria Sobolewska, who's Professor of Political Science here at the University of Manchester. Also still, I think, lead investigator on the SRC's UK and Change Europe project, the Brexit referendum and identity politics in Britain. And we have Lord David Willetts, who's President of the Advisory Council at the Resolution Foundation of their Intergenerational Centre. He's also, obviously, a Member of Parliament for Havant, 1992 to 2015, Minister of Universities and Science. Previously worked at Treasury and Number 10 Policy Institute, and is a visiting professor at the Policy Institute at King's, which we're delighted about. And then we have Professor Tim Bale, who's Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and recently appointed, I think, Deputy Director of UK and a Changing Europe. Congratulations to Tim. So each of the panellists is going to give 5 or 6 minutes of thoughts before plenty of time for your input and reflection. So first I want to set the scene a little bit by drawing on this report, which we published a couple of weeks ago, where we pulled together all the evidence that we could find on whether the UK was really polarising or not. We called it Divided Britain with a very important question mark at the end there, because it was mainly driven by an uneasiness about how quickly and completely the assumption was that we were more polarised than we've ever been, how accepted that has been. Most speeches talk about, political and media speeches talk about divided Britain. We're even seeing common reference to culture wars creeping into the UK debate, importing wholesale, a kind of US thinking that we think doesn't really fit with what's going on here. So we had a more systematic look at the evidence. We did have copies, but I think we're more or less out of copies for you now. It's popular because it's optimistic about the future of Britain. People are looking for a little bit of optimism about what brings us together rather than what divides us. But if you do want copies, you can get some from Hermione, or sign up for some from Hermione, and it's apparently at the top of our Twitter feed for the Policy Institute, if you want to just get the link from there. So I only want to make 5 quick points on it. The first is definitional. So in the US literature, there is a distinction between effective or emotional polarisation on the one hand, and then issue polarisation on the other. So it sounds quite techy and academic, but it's really, really important. So effective polarisation is where the extent to which you identify with one group and then denigrate an out-group, the other group. And there's strong evidence of this around Brexit. So on identity, 44% of people now say that their Brexit identity is very strong, compared with only 9% saying their party identity is very strong. That's a huge change. Party ID was up at that sort of level in the 1960s, but has been declining since then. So we've had party de-alignment, which has been replaced by this Brexit identity. And there's many aspects to this. So you're more likely to think your own side is intelligent, open-minded, honest, and that the other side is selfish, hypocritical, and closed-minded. And that works both directions, almost exact mirror of each other. The other side are always wrong in terms of their character. There's only now a minority of people who say they'd be happy if their kids married someone from the other side of the divide. And only half are even happy to talk to people from the other side. And this has happened really quickly. This is not saying that Brexit caused this. We talk about it in terms of it revealed and reinforced this sense of identity, but it has consolidated very, very quickly into a very strong identity when you compare it with the US evidence. Second point is, the real benefit of getting these two definitions in mind is that there's lots of evidence that we can have effective polarisation. We can dislike the other side while not actually really disagreeing on lots of the issues, not having nearly the same sense of distance. And there's really not nearly as much evidence that we're miles apart on lots of the issues. On many domestic policy issues, there's much more common ground between people. Whoa! There you go. This happens in a lot of my speeches. People need to add a bit of drama. Whining on about polarisation definitions. Thank you,
Makes
Tim.
it more interesting.
Exactly. Oh, sneezing is more interesting than my talk. Thank you. That's cool.
I'm not saying that.
Okay, thank you. Cool. So even on contentious issues like immigration, we're not nearly as far apart as people think. Most people are in the middle balancing different types of approaches. Even on Brexit, where there is a difference in views, that misses quite often that people hold multiple views on Brexit, even as the most polarised issue, where a range of different outcomes would be acceptable to a range of individuals. It's not the case that people are utterly divided on that, which leads to the third point, is that the Brexit attachments, while strong in terms of emotion and identity, are not coherent or consistent within each side of the Leave or Remain debate. So 1/3 of Leave supporters think we should open ourselves up to the world, very open, global outlook. But 1/3 see the rest of the world as a threat and want to hunker down and protect ourselves, in terms of the Leave vote, and the other third are in the middle. But it's the same on the Remain side. The Remain side, only half of Remain voters say they have a strong attachment, a strong emotional identity attachment to Europe. The other half are much more pragmatic, instrumental views of staying, which doesn't really come across in the commentary. The fourth point is, while this Brexit identity has become very strong and important, older left-right attachments have not gone away. It's still very important and prominent, particularly on economic issues, as you might imagine. So nearly 9 in 10 Labour supporters believe the economy is rigged in favour of the rich and powerful, compared with under half of Conservative voters. But on other issues like immigration, whether immigration takes jobs from native-born population, Conservative and Labour Leave voters are much closer together than the Remain voters from either side of from their own party. And then on issues like what type of society we want, one focused on rewarding individual success, or one that's focused on collective provision. And that runs almost a perfect spectrum, from Conservative Leavers on the one hand, all the way down through the groups to Labour Remain on the other hand. So different views of society, these two things interacting. So all this adds up for us in the report to fragmentation on issues and what brings us together, not polarisation. There's a famous chart by Pew Research Center in the US, which they call the moving mountains chart. And it's effectively, it just plots Republican and Democrat supporters and their kind of average views. And in the 80s and 90s, it was kind of two mountains that had a lot of overlap between them. So there was difference between them, but there was a lot of overlap between them. And then they just moved apart over the years. So there's virtually no overlap between Republican and Democrat supporters on a range of political issues. No, we don't have that here. We don't have these two monolithic blocks facing each other and drifting apart. We have a much more shattered landscape with lots of, we can't think of a better word, we're talking about lumps. We have lots of lumps across our landscape rather than two massive monolithic mountains. It's not even a two-way split. We don't have a simple four-quadrant chart with left and right going one way, liberal authoritarian going the other way. It's much more nuanced and interconnected than that. So they're the kind of key themes from the report. And what we're living through now is a political system that's straining to capture this new map, this new map of identities, with Brexit identity pulling the party system towards it. That's where we conclude in the report. We don't say anything about what's going to happen next, because we had to rewrite the report about 6 times over the summer, because everything kept shifting around. But no doubt my excellent panel will have great insight into what's coming up next. Thank you. So, yes, Maria, what's the answer?
Well, so actually I wanted to go back in history at the beginning, which is the question posed to this panel was, are we more divided? And certainly when we read the newspapers and we listen to our politicians, we have a sense that Britain has never been divided, so now these divisions are appearing out of nowhere and we are more and more divided. But actually we don't need to even know history that well to know that it is entirely false. And this country has had many more deeper divisions, for example, over religion. So the conflict over religion was not only much more deeper, with much greater segregation between the two options and, of course, historical violence, but actually we also had this sense of complete lack of cooperation. So the issue went extremely deep, and it went to people's identity. So now when we talk about identity politics, again, we have to remember that this is not new, that we have had identity politics conflicts before in Britain, and they were very strong. And in fact, the very origins of our party system lie in that identity politics conflict. And so coming back to what Bobby said about our party system struggling to react, it is actually quite curious because it was designed around a very polarizing bipolar identity divide. But we had other divisions historically, division of a class. Both class divisions and religious divisions have actually weakened over time. So our society has become less segregated and less divided in many, many ways. And so onto this landscape, now we have these new politics of identity. And I think this is why we look to the US so much, because it seems that nowadays the identity divides seem much more familiar to the US landscape than to the traditional British landscape. So we argue over immigration, but often immigration is a kind of code word for diversity. And especially racial and ethnic diversity does seem to draw people into these two opposing camps. And of course, I agree entirely that they are not opposing in a sense that there is no overlap, there's distribution of opinions, but they are these kind of two ideal models at each end of the spectrum. On the one hand, there are people who now proactively value diversity. They think diversity is a social good, something to be defended, something to be valued, something to be kind of sing the praises of. Whereas on the other hand, we have this sense that it is moving too fast, people are being left behind, and very often using this kind of trope of political correctness gone mad. So each one of these sides judges each other harshly. One end accuses the other of being racist, and the other accuses the first of being politically correct. So we do have that affective polarization already embedded very much in the principles of this debate. And this is why we turn to the US, because this is, of course, a classic conflict over race that the US has had for decades. And so it is very familiar. But of course, this is where the similarities with the US end. And also, I think one of the things that is very rarely appreciated in that context is that the main reason that we were never divided over racial diversity and ethnic diversity in this country was not because we didn't have a lot of it, and now it's emerged as a result of increase in the population of diverse backgrounds. But the actual reason is that the society has become much more liberal. So now we have two sides because no longer do we have everybody on the same side. So when you look at the public opinion polling in the 60s or even 70s, the support for notions of, call it immigration, and that is the phrase used in those polling questions at that time, was bad for Britain. People were supporting forced deportation in quite, surprisingly huge numbers back in the day. And this percentage of people who didn't like ethnic diversity has been shrinking extremely fast. So over the kind of 40, 50 years, we have a society that has gone from about 80% agreeing that diversity was a bad thing to only about 30-something% agreeing that diversity is a bad thing, and not even expressing it in this kind of strong language anymore either. So in a sense, our polarization over this issue might not necessarily be a bad thing. And this brings me to the second point, which is that we often think polarization is always a bad thing. Division is always a bad thing. But from the point of view of society, I think it often means that we are engaging in a meaningful debate about an issue that is new. And we are having two very strong points to this debate. And then one might prevail, or we might agree to disagree, or something else might in fact arise and will change the topic of conversation. But it doesn't mean that we cannot talk over this divide, over this disagreement, and in fact it is not a negative thing at all. One thing that you have to remember when we think about the society becoming more liberal is that even the part of society that now we think is less liberal is in fact hugely much more liberal than this similar kind of comparable part of society would have been 50 years ago as well. So clearly, already there is a result to this conversation and this polarization, and it is the overall movement towards the liberal end of the spectrum on race, immigration, and ethnic diversity. So if we agree that either the society is not as divided as it was in the past, and that polarization is not such a bad thing, then I think the question has to be about politics. To what extent is our politics fit for purpose, and to what extent the kind of moral panic that we experience over identity politics, polarization, divisions is in fact the result of kind of artificial panic that has almost limited to a political spectrum, the politics of Brexit, the politics of identity politics, rather than the society itself. And I do think the big problem with our society is that it is trying to fit these multiple options and opinions and this active debate into a system that forces bimodality. It forces polarization. But of course, we also know that as a society, we have been rejecting it. So apart from the one peak in 2017 when everybody has come back to voting for the two parties, that is now long gone. So I think that the debate now has to be about how will the party system change in response. And I think there are three scenarios. The first one, so now I'm coming back to the future, what might happen. The first one, and I think quite likely, is that the existing political parties will simply realign over these new divisions and presumably borrowing that strong identity of Brexit, and one party will seek to become the party of Brexit, and the other party will seek to become a party of Remain. And this is obviously fraught with difficulty, and one of the big issues around the Conservative Party, since we are here, I'll cover that one first, is that seems like a very short-sighted policy. So becoming a party of Brexit, party of Leave, is siding yourself with a demographic that is declining. So social change is only going in one direction on this, and even though we are not that divided over Brexit in terms of political opinions, we are very divided over Brexit in terms of our socio-demographic backgrounds. So all the people are much more likely to be leavers. We also see the division over education. So education has emerged as this big influence. So people who don't have university education are much more likely to be supportive of Brexit and of Leave than people with university education. So it is the kind of death by demographic that the Conservative Party was panicking about with minority voters. It's kind of re-emerging if the Conservative Party is going for this strict Brexit identity. And of course, Labour has the exact kind of mirror image problem, because of course, if they become a party of Remain, they are further losing those left behind voters from the kind of core voters, working class northern seats. So even though I think still this is the most likely scenario, this is going to be problematic for the parties. One scenario that I think must be mentioned, again in context of history, is that one of the parties will be replaced. And this, of course, has happened with the Liberals, who were replaced in our two-party system by the Labour Party. And it has not happened in one election, it has happened over 3 elections, but it has happened. And it might happen again. So that kind of assumption that these two parties are here to stay forever is again reflecting our lack of engagement with our history and our past. And which party that might be, whether it will be Liberal Democrats or Brexit Party or something new entirely, is for anyone to place bets now, basically, go to Betfair. And of course, the third option, and this is one that I'm always tempted by the most, but I'm not sure how likely it is that Brexit will fade away. And I think one of the countries to look to for how that might happen is, in fact, Scotland, where the independence referendum has reshaped Scottish politics around that vote in the referendum. So whether you voted to leave the UK or you voted for independence was almost perfectly aligned with how you voted in the next general election. But then, of course, the Brexit referendum happened in Scotland as well as here, and this has rewritten, again, the Scottish politics. And so I think, we don't know what might happen, but there could be an event, I don't know, another global recession or climate emergency of some sorts that actually hit us in the face for once. And that might actually change the conversation. So there you have it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Dave.
That was very interesting, and thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here. Look, I'm just going to focus on one divide which I think is becoming increasingly significant, even as other divides decline in significance, and that is the divide by age. And let me just give you some of the basic statistics on what is happening to voting behaviour by age. So through the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, the Conservative Party was getting about 40% plus of the vote of 30-year-olds. In 1979, we got 45% of 30-year-olds voting Conservative. We are now down to the position where we get about 25% of the vote of 30-year-olds. And meanwhile, amongst 70-year-olds, where our vote was a bit above 40%, the vote of people aged 70 has now reached 60% voting Tory. So if you are aged 70, you are twice as likely to vote Tory than if you're aged 30. Now, that shift reflects significantly Brexit. I don't think it's just Brexit, but it reflects the age distribution of Brexit voters. So for people aged 25 to 34, 62% voted Remain and 38% voted Leave. For people aged over 65, 40% voted Remain and 60% voted Leave. Now, I don't think older people voted Leave because they hated younger people. If anything, a lot of older people said, I must do this for my kids so they can be in a free country. Hence, one of the neatest definitions of the Brexit vote, which it was grandma's worst ever Christmas present. It's like the sort of pullover that doesn't fit. They thought they were doing this for their kids, so it wasn't delivered out of generational hatred. The rise of age-based voting has displaced class-based voting. I completely agree with Maria's excellent analysis. So back in 1974, people in social classes A, B, C, 1, 56% 56% voted Conservative and 19% voted Labour. So there was a 37 percentage point lead for Conservatives amongst the affluent middle classes. In 2017, it was 44% voting Conservative and 40% voting Labour. So it's down to a 4% lead. Amongst C2s, back in 1974, Conservatives got 26% of the vote and Labour got 49%. Now it is level pegging at 40-40. So class has ceased to be a predictor of voting behaviour and age has instead become the predictor of voting behaviour. I think this reflects an underlying economic reality. I don't think it is just attitudinal, and it is not just views of Brexit. The fact is, younger people, almost whatever their class, are having a tougher time economically, and older people, again, almost regardless of their class, are having a better time economically. We've reached the stage where a pensioner household is less likely to be poor than a working age family. We've reached the stage where even the sons and daughters in their 20s and 30s of relatively affluent parents are not necessarily going to believe they can get started on the housing ladder. The great Conservative project of spreading ownership has gone into reverse. There is much less ownership, property ownership, amongst younger voters, so we shouldn't be surprised if they don't identify so strongly with our party. Now, oddly enough, this means there is something we can do about this. This age base of Tory support is a result of policy decisions that we have taken. Back in Margaret Thatcher's day, and I worked in the policy under her, in Margaret Thatcher's day, the policy on pensions was we first of all did a 5% real cut in the value of the basic state pension, and it was then frozen in real terms, only increased in line with prices, even as wages went ahead. At the same time, we regularly indexed child benefit with prices. In the last few years, Conservatives have offered a triple lock on pensions, ensuring that whatever economic circumstances, pensions rise in real terms, whilst at the same time freezing the value of child benefit, so its real value, freezing the cash child benefit, so its real value is falling by 20%. When at resolution we do an analysis across age of the impact of explicit tax and benefit policy measures since 2015, it's very clear. The losers are aged 20 in their 20s and 30s, and the gainers are in their 50s and 60s. So this is partly just a kind of set of decisions we have taken, not always explicitly recognising what we're doing, but they are the result of a shift in the Conservative Party's balance of its policies towards older voters, and we could change that. Finally, let me say that I don't believe that the generations are in a state of war with each other. The other bit of good news is that generations do actually care about each other. Older voters do want their kids and grandkids to get started on the housing ladder. And younger people actually do want granny to have a decent pension. There is an intergenerational contract. The challenge, and I'd always love quoting Burke, and if you want at some point, I'll seize the opportunity and quote Burke on the contract between generations, but there is an obligation between the generations. And actually that sense that we want to pass on our country in better shape to our children and grandchildren than we have found it, I think is a very powerful urge for us both in our personal lives and in politics and public policy. The challenge for us is whether the Conservative Party, in the way it is currently conducting policy, is living up to that obligation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Okay, thank you very much. I love David's analogy of Grandma's worst Christmas present. I certainly know that when I was younger, I would always ask her if she'd kept the receipt. Let's see. Right, how many of you are members of the Conservative Party here? Put your hand up. Okay, so maybe about half, something like that. What I'm going to focus on, and I do assure you not just because I've got a book to sell on this, although of course in the attention economy, everybody tells me exists now, I do have to mention that. I'm going to focus on party members because actually, if you look at party members, you do see an enormous degree of polarisation, or at least you see a very polarised situation, even if we can't talk so much about change over time. I'll give you an idea of what I mean. Labour Party members and Conservative Party members are almost two tribes now. They disagree on practically everything. I'll just give you a few examples. I'm not going to give you a complete blizzard of statistics here, but let's give you some examples. So, some of them are fairly obvious, right? We give them statements, so we surveyed them in 2017, and we gave them statements. So one of them was government should redistribute from the better off, okay, to poorer people. 92% of Labour members believed that was the case. 14% of Conservative members believed that should be the case. Okay, so that's 90% something of Labour Party members want government to redistribute. Just a little bit more than 10% of Conservative members wanted that. And you can go through all those measures that we use traditionally to measure left and right and see that there's huge differences between the two. You can also talk about what political scientists refer to, and I think I'm a bit bothered about the language, but the liberty authority scale, okay, the extent to which people are, if you like, socially conservative or socially liberal. And again, you see some absolutely massive differences there. Let's take, for example, schools should teach children to obey authority. Okay, now for the Conservatives, disagreement with that is minimal, absolutely minimal. For the Labour Party, just under half of all Labour Party members disagree with that statement. Okay, and you can go through looking at law and order, capital punishment, respect for traditional values, and see these completely polarised tribes of party members. You can do something a little bit more sophisticated and do something called cluster analysis, and I'm not going to go into great detail on that. But if you do cluster analysis, you can identify 4 clusters across party members of all parties. So there's a kind of socially liberal left, there's a socially conservative left, which a lot of UKIP supporters are in, by the way, and presumably Brexit party supporters, and there's a socially conservative right, and there's a conventional centre. Now, no one party's members fit in, totally to one of these clusters, but it is the case that 70% of Tory members, when you do the statistical operation, come out as socially conservative right wing. Okay? Number of Labour members who come out as socially conservative right wing, literally 0%. Okay? If we look at it the other way round, 67% of Labour members come out as socially liberal left. Number of Conservatives who come out as socially liberal left, 0.4% of Conservative Party members. So there's this huge difference. It's interesting, by the way, the Lib Dems are very much in the conventional centre, as you would expect. So there are some very big differences between the two parties, but there are also big differences on how they see, for example, candidate selection. And this speaks to this issue that Maria was talking about, which is sort of ethnicity, difference, diversity. Just to give you, again, just a very quick portrait of some of this. We ask party members whether they'd like to see more MPs of particular groups. So we ask them about working class people, we ask them about people with disabilities, young people, etc., etc. We also ask them about women, but we also ask them about ethnic minority. So would you like to see more ethnic minority MPs in Parliament? So for Labour, 87% agreed with that. For the Liberal Democrats, 82% agreed with that. Okay, so an overwhelming number of Liberal Democrats and Labour Party members would like to see more ethnic minority MPs in Parliament. For the Conservatives, 32%. Okay, what about Muslim MPs? Would you like to see more MPs from a Muslim religion? For the Labour Party, 73%. The Lib Dems, less so, 57%. For the Conservatives, 18%. Okay, so there are big differences, I think, in terms of identity and representation as well as policy. These are two tribes. And what about Brexit? Let's talk a little bit about Brexit. We surveyed Labour and Conservative Party members in Christmas 2018 on this issue, and again, huge differences. We asked them if they were in favour of a second referendum. 79% of Labour members said they were in favour of holding a second referendum. 14% of Conservative Party members said the same. We asked them if there were a second referendum, how would they vote in that referendum? 88% of Labour members said they would vote to remain in a second referendum. 15% of Conservative Party members said they would vote remain, which I was actually quite impressed with. I thought it might be lower than that, but anyway. And then on the question of the moment, even though we asked it back in December, we asked them whether they agreed with the statement that leaving with no deal would occasion severe disruption and shortages. 82% of Labour members were convinced that leaving with no deal would cause disruption and shortages. Just 18% of Conservative Party members believed that that was the case. Now, I can only explain that by the fact that we hadn't yet, the UK and the Changing Europe, released our report on no-deal Brexit, because obviously the figures would have been completely different at that stage, because you can see that there is a serious possibility of disruption at the very least, not only in the short term, but maybe in the medium and long term. But once again, it testifies to the fact that when it comes to party politics, when it comes to the members of political parties, they are very polarised, much more polarised actually than the public. Okay? Now the question is, does this matter? Does it matter that 189,000 Conservative Party members feel that way, or a certain proportion of them? Does it matter that 400,000 or so Labour Party members feel that way, and 125,000 Liberal Democrat members feel that way? Does it actually make any difference? I would suggest that it does, because these are very active, very civilly minded, very engaged, very vocal folk. They help to some extent to set the tone of public discourse. They also, to some extent, help push their parties in particular directions. I think one of the most interesting paradoxes about British politics over the last 20 years has been the fact that the members of the political party which gives them no rights on policy at all have probably had the biggest effect on policy. I think that by a drip, drip, drip effect, Conservative Party members, partly by talking to their MPs, partly by who they select, have helped push the party in a much more Eurosceptic direction than might otherwise have been the case. Interestingly, the opposite is the case for Labour. If Jeremy Corbyn genuinely wanted to listen to his members and genuinely wanted to do what his members would do, we would not have seen the farcical situation we saw at the Brighton Labour Party conference, where loyalty to Jeremy was stressed above the views of party members on Brexit, and in the end Jeremy got what he wanted, despite the fact that party members more generally don't want to sit on the fence in the way that he wants to. So I just leave you with that thought. Is it the case that the fact that we have two tribes when it comes to party members actually helping to influence the way that the parties speak about things, the policies that the parties put forward, or does it make very little difference to public opinion at all?
Thank you. Just come briefly to the panel for reflections on that. Just one point from on me, just reflecting on Tim's evidence there is certainly from the US, the evidence is that there's a transmission mechanism that goes from elected representatives to activists and then to the public, that it does come down in those types of ways. When you're talking about increasingly polarised positions within and between parties, so there is evidence that this could be the start of that type of process if we are not there already. So that's kind of less optimistic interpretation.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, I think that's an interesting one. There you've got a transmission mechanism from above to below, and I suppose what I'm suggesting is maybe it's a reciprocal process in the sense that that below is influencing the above, and then the above is influencing the below, etc., etc. Because just one last boring stat from me. When we questioned Conservative Party members after the 2015 election, just after the 2015 election, David Cameron had won it, he was marvellous, he was going to go to Brussels and negotiate a deal, bring it back, and hopefully win a referendum. Remember that? We asked Conservative Party members how they were going to vote in the upcoming referendum. So they knew there was going to be a referendum. How would you vote in that? 66% of Conservative Party members told us that they would wait to see what David Cameron came back with before they decide how to vote. Okay, so relatively open-minded. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't always, in some ways, perhaps destined to vote for Brexit. But at least what they said, they were prepared to give them a chance. To a situation where, as I say now, 2/3 of Conservative Party members would actually be quite happy to leave without a deal. Now, how did that happen? I suspect that part of the reason that happened was because celebrity politicians in the Conservative Party, I don't need to name names, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, etc., were giving party members that message. And I think party members, to some extent, do take their cues, as Bobby said, from their MPs, particularly celebrity MPs.
Great. Any other reflections before we get your questions ready? Everyone, we do have a microphone. Anything to come back?
I'd make one comment, because in what we can now see, we're talking about greater division. We're now seeing the Conservative Party with an electoral strategy, which actually began under Theresa. It was also our strategy in the 2017 election, and Boris is supposed to have said to Anne Milton, the MP for Guildford, when she said to him, "Carry on like this, we will lose Guildford," which she kind of said, well, that may be the price we pay. We lose Guildford and Winchester, but we gain Labour Brexit seats in Midlands and the North. And if you look at the attitudes of the Brexiteer voters that we are going for, some of the traditional divides disappear. They're certainly much more spending on the welfare state. And I think one thing that's just beginning to filter through in our party conference is what this political strategy means for the Conservative Party. When our voters, these people won't just come for us because of Brexit plus a bit of cultural war, being against transgender lose. We're going to have some of the things that we think about at resolution: low pay, how you're managing on universal credit, how much money goes into the welfare state. If we really want to gain and keep these voters, Conservative policies have to change quite significantly in all the classic areas of domestic politics. And so another divide has to be broken down.
Great, thanks. Great. So hands up, please. Yes, and then over here.
Hello?
Yep.
Hello?
Oh, try again.
Hello?
Just shout.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Is it switched on?
It is on.
Just hold it to your mouth.
Okay. Oliver Jakes, District Councillor, Warwick and Leamington. In a post-Brexit Britain, if it's possible to imagine, do you think, with the aim of addressing polarisation due to Brexit, is there a role for planned deliberate policies, policy frameworks to address polarisation, or should it be left to civil society to sort out for itself?
Okay, policy or civil society, great. And just go across the row then.
Hi, my name's Andy. I work for a support provider for adults with learning disabilities and autism. My question is about social care, because there are increasingly calls for a cross-party solution to social care so that there can be long-term sustainability in the sector. What is the hope for social care in an era of fragmentation and polarisation? And I guess on the reverse, what is the scope for issues such as social care being a mechanism to bring people back together politically?
Great. And go to the end. Yeah.
Thank you. As an aside, you said you've called things lumps. Could I suggest that it could be called colonies? So now politics are becoming colonised into benign and malignant groups that own the society. You're talking about effectively the changes in the social cleavages which is happening in our society. Is there any indication that they are reforming into solid divides which will support the future two-party system, or are we inevitably ending up to a system which is going to have to go to a multi-party system?
Great question. Let's take those three, and then if we can keep it quite brief, so we can try and get in at least one more round. That would be great. Do you want to go first?
Yes, so can I start with the last one, because I think that's more speaking to my research on this. So I think Bobby already mentioned that there is this affective polarisation between the two kind of Brexit camps, with one thinking the other one is less intelligent than the other. But actually, Rob Ford and myself, we're writing a book about Brexit, and we have done something else, which is addresses your question directly. So we asked people not whether, well, we also asked them, do you think the other side is less intelligent, etc. But we also asked them about whether there are any real socio-demographic differences between these groups. And what we found is that people do think that there are these real divides. So they do think that the Remainers are younger and better and more tolerant, for example, which you would think was a kind of affective question, but actually it's a question about, you know, your views of immigrants, for example. And so these blocks, even though they seem amorphous, actually are more concrete than you think, given that we have this role of education, age in them. So it is possible that this will become a new kind of more firm divide, although I do think that Brexit as an issue will probably expand in that case if these were to become those more solid blocks, and there'll be other policy issues around that will get incorporated into that Brexit divide.
Great. Tim, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, speaking to the last one a little as well, I mean, I think there is a question as to how long we can carry on with the electoral system we have, given the party system we have. And there's always been a little bit of a mismatch, but I do wonder if the mismatch is becoming, you know, actually unsustainable over time. But how we move on in that respect, I have no idea, because obviously we had a referendum in 2011. We rejected Nick Clegg's miserable little compromise at that stage. You know, whether we can actually adjust our politics by adjusting our electoral system, I have no idea. On social care, I think that's a really interesting question, because we will be looking around, won't we, if we leave, when we leave, for things that can pull us back together, that, you know, can be part of a kind of project of national renewal, if you like. And And doing something about social care would be an obvious thing to do. It affects so many people, and it hits people to some extent irrespective of their class background, because a lot of it has to do with, you know, just medical chance. That, you know, it could be rather like the NHS was in 1945, you know, some sort of foundational infrastructural project. I think people actually would be rather more impressed by that than they would by bridges, etc. You know, I think there is a huge opportunity for a party that wants to seize the nettle on that, but then it does slightly require the other party maybe to allow them to seize the nettle. You know, let's see. So, I mean, this comes back to the question about post-Brexit Britain. You know, is it policy or is it civil society? I guess it has to be, you know, a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, you know, we're all going to have to make a commitment once it happens, if it happens, to make the best of it. And I guess if, you know, we trade in national stereotypes, then hopefully we're still that sort of people who can kind of muddle through this thing and get through it. But, you know, given how fragmented, I was going to say polarised we are at the moment, I'm not so sure.
David?
Yeah, on the first question, it is policy as well as civil society, and the second question, social care, is a very good example. And look, we are, as a Conservative, and I may be the only member of the panel who is actually a member of the Conservative Party, and I am one of the 5 million Tories who voted Remain in the referendum, for whom I hope there remains a place in the Conservative Party. But on social care, it's a very vivid example of the dilemma facing our party. If you look at the shape of the British state now, compared with other advanced Western economies, the British state is above all dominated by spending on health and pension. We are reshaping the state to be a device which delivers services for older people, because by far the biggest users of the NHS are also old. So the Conservative Party is redesigning a state for older people and doing much less for young people. For me, the nightmare future of our party is we become a party of old people who vote for extracting revenues from younger people to provide services that we want for ourselves. And I know how horrific the politics was of the social care in Theresa May's election, but the fact is, if affluent older property owners are not willing to contribute to the costs of their social care, and instead taxes have to rise on a working age population of non-property owners, Remain voters, in order to fund the social care, that will exacerbate the very divides we're trying to overturn. And then, finally, I hope we don't end up as a Brexit Remain divide, but I can see the prospect of that happening.
Right. Thank you. So lots more hands. So if we come, I think I did say for this gentleman here at the front. Then behind, and then here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keith Best, former MP and Secretary of the European Movement. I want to come back to a point that Tim Bale made. I stood in the local government elections last year for what for me was a hopeless seat, and so I wasn't expecting to be elected, and the electorate certainly didn't disappoint me. But what I found amazing was in a very small ward, I counted over 800 mixed ballots, and I saw everything from Labour, Conservative, Polish nationalist, to Green, Liberal Democrat, Labour. I mean, it was every combination. And to me, that smacked of one thing. People want a multi-choice system. They are not polarised in political parties anymore. They don't see one party delivering all their aspirations. They actually want a mix. And I really would invite the rest of the panel to move further than Tim Bale did about whether we are now meeting crunching point in terms of a change in the electoral system.
Great point. Thank you. Just you give it behind, actually. There you go.
Hi, I'm Duncan from a grant-making foundation. 3 quick points about this issue about parties not reflecting where we are. So geography, I wonder if you might say more about that, because the big is the UK falling apart because of how England voted? Question. Second, though, is increasingly these parts, the 30 to 40% that don't correspond to the main bloc. So you've got the older people who voted Remain, who are some of the angriest because they don't like being lumped in with Leavers. You've got the Londoners who voted Leave and Scots who voted Leave. So all these, the 30, 40% you feel let down by in the party system, the fragmentation. And the third point, I read a very depressing comment that we were facing the Ulsterisation of British politics. this sense that the population might move on in lots of things. You said it may do, but the parties are stuck. So in Ulster, they're stuck by where they sit on a major divide, and we might be stuck by how you voted in 2017. You look at the tale of Iraq that shapes Labour Party internal things 10, 15 years on. Are we going to be faced by, however much the population moves on, we're stuck in camps that we can't move out of?
Very good, very good. Very good questions. I'll come to the panel. Just on Keith's point, just a sort of general research finding is when you look at party attachment generationally, it's one of the most remarkable generationally cohort-driven patterns that you see. So when you look at the pre-war generation, those born in 1945 or before, around 70% of them say they feel connected to one particular political party. And it's been the same throughout their life. You can kind of trace it from the 1980s all the way to now. It's absolutely flat. And then it drops down a level to about 55% for baby boomers. 55% of baby boomers feel attached to one particular political party and have throughout their life. And there's a big gap down to about 35% for Gen X, for my generation, where only 35% feel attached to any one particular political party. And now it's 20% for millennials, and Gen Z are coming in about the same sort of level. So it's reached rock bottom. And that, again, for millennials, it's been 20%. It goes up and down a little bit around elections, but it doesn't shift systematically over that time. So you have got this massive de-alignment where you cannot count on a block of voters that is just going to come with your party. And it goes to that point of people are shopping around more, want to combine different things, and it kind of fits with how society has changed generally. So just as a bit of context. But if we can take all of those great comments and questions and come to you again first, Maria.
Yes, well, it's such an enormous, actually all of these questions were so enormous, it's hard to know what to pick on first. But on the mixed ballots, it's actually, it's become very observable and very common to mix your ballots and split your identities across different voting, actually as a result of devolution. This was the first time really that people were given this option, and because the devolved assemblies have different electoral system, that gave voters this opportunity, and once they were given it, they liked it, right? And so I always feel that if we were to change our electoral system, it will have to be a kind of cross-party will to do it. Because, of course, if we do end up with a government elected with a majority using the current system, they are never going to want to change it because it's delivered them what they wanted. But I think even though we voted against the measurable compromise in 2011, the truth is once we get it, we'll probably like it, because I think people do like to, especially with the increasing expressive voting of young people especially. And this, I guess, kind of fits with geography a little bit as well. I do think certain geographies also have this additional ability to vote in multiple level elections. And these are the geographies who are increasingly ill-fitting with some of these other geographies in England. And I wonder to what extent, if we were to pursue devolution further, that actually could be evened out at the end of the day, that we would see a greater Manchester kind of Devo-Manc scenarios, and then the politics will adapt and change. But one thing that I think is rarely mentioned, too rarely mentioned, in terms of geography, that sometimes geography reflects these very issues that I think David mentioned about economy. Our society, our country is becoming more geographically unequal, and it is about those towns, those kind of dying bits of England and Britain, and those very dynamic cities. And of course the dynamic cities attract certain types of population, and those dying towns are more described by who leaves, who is left behind in them, than who arrives there. And so this is an enormous issue, but I think this needs to be discussed as well.
Tim, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pick up on that. I mean, I think it's understandable why the Conservative Party, moved away from going to Blackpool at its conference, but Blackpool maybe would have been a useful reminder to the Conservative Party, of what happens when you let places effectively die. Coming to Manchester's great, Birmingham's great, etc. But maybe there was something lost there in that respect. In terms of the electoral system, I agree with Maria. I mean, I'm sure if we were to manage to change the electoral system, and I hold my hand up, I am a fan of changing the electoral system, we would probably find that we were perfectly happy. In New Zealand, which is the one Westminster system that's gone straight to a PR system in the early 1990s, that is the lesson. I mean, the lesson is also that it takes a Prime Minister to misread his briefing note on live TV and promise a referendum for it to happen. However, New Zealanders were also offered more recently the chance to change back to first past the post system, and they rejected it in favour of the LNP system that they have. Your point about disabilities, I think, is a really good one, and perhaps David can speak to that a little bit as well, because sometimes we make this distinction, and it was in the question about policy and civil society between the two things, when it's clearly not the case. I mean, one of the problems with austerity, one of the many problems with austerity, was that it cut local authority funding, and therefore in cutting local authority funding, it cut funding to a lot of voluntary groups who did precisely the kind of advocacy that you were talking
Like
about.
self-advocacy groups.
Absolutely. So you, in some senses, David knows far more about this than me. You can't expect civil society to suddenly flourish in a vacuum. It does need a little bit of help and support from the state. In terms of the Ulsterisation of British politics, I really hope that you're not right about that, or whoever you were reading, was not right about that. And it's an extremely catchy phrase, which I can see, would start getting used in the media, like culture wars, like the Left Behind, which actually sometimes tells us less than it tells us more. But you may be right, or he may be right, or she may be right. Let's hope not.
Thank you, Tim. David.
Well, you can see a two-party scenario. I understand why Keith puts it the way he does, but someone implied in one of the questions, kind of, after we've done Brexit, then what will happen? Brexit, to everyone's frustration, regardless of whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer, is a very long process. There is no way, even we do a sort of no-deal Brexit, a version of Theresa's deal, which is essentially just a preamble. All it does is set out the rights of citizens in the EU and the UK, something on accumulated financial liabilities, and the Irish backstop. The trade negotiations for our links to Europe have not yet begun. Brexit, disentangling 40 years of participation in this single market, is a decade to 20-year process. We've sent the European Medicines Agency from London to Amsterdam, so we don't want to be part of the European Medicines Regulator. We've not yet decided if we're going to regulate our own medicines on some unique British standards, or continue to follow European standards, or throw in with the Americans. So there's no way around. This is a long-run political issue that will dominate politics, and it may therefore continue to promote a two-party system around attitudes to Europe. And of course, the 2017 election, we should just remember, Tim refers to this in passing, was one which saw a concentration of votes in the two main parties, with Labour at that point the receptacle for many Remainers who thought it would end up being more pro-Remain than it has been under Corbyn. So you may see that last. If we won't go down Keith's route, there are, with this reflecting the diversity of opinion beyond two parties, we would have to adjust to coalitions. And having worked in coalition in the Cameron cabinet with the Lib Dems, I personally think the historians will judge the coalition government as a reasonably effective domestic policy government. But the political penalty which the Lib Dems took for serving in that coalition will make it very hard for any junior partner to be willing to go into this again. And we would be talking, another one of the paradoxes of Brexit, we're talking yet again of another example, I think, of not of British politics Ulsterising, British politics Europeanising. We are converging in so many ways on the politics of Italy or whatever, as we wrestle with Brexit. So I think it's, but I personally think you can see a Remain-Brexit divide shaping British politics for a decade at least.
Thank you on that optimistic note. And spot on time, 12 o'clock on the dot. Just remains for me to say thank you to all of you for coming, and some great comments and questions. Really appreciate that. Thanks to the Policy Institute team who organised this with UK in a Changing Europe's team. And of course, thank you to our excellent panel. And don't forget the report. Thank you very much.
Or my book, The Pinch.
David Willetts.
Second edition next month.
Or Tim's book. Or Maria's forthcoming book. Yeah.